Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. I am Eleni Bastet, the director of the International Studies Institute, and it is really our pleasure and honor to have all of you here, and of course our esteemed speakers you will see in a minute. And I just said maybe we can play musical chairs and give our chair up to someone else, maybe 20 minutes down the line or whatever, so we don't discourage anyone from coming and staying. This is part of a 2-week-long lecture series that the International Studies Institute has organized, Modern Societies in Crisis, Global Challenges and Solutions. During the last 5 years, we have witnessed unprecedented upheavals that have pitted the principles of democracy, multiculturalism, and respect for human dignity against often intransigent political and religious positions. Concurrently, the economic crisis affecting several countries within the European Union has caused increased unrest within and beyond the EU. Speakers have been addressing the crisis of modernity from the local to the multinational levels, comparing developments around the world and examining problems and proposed solutions. Modern societies in crisis, global challenges and solutions will enhance, we believe, the community's understanding of current political and economic upheavals and their effects on New Mexico and the Southwest. We're proud of the mix of UNM faculty, New Mexico scholars and activists, as well as scholars and participants from the US and abroad. So we have 5 UNM faculty, full-time faculty participating here. Jenny Moore being one of them. We have 3 New Mexico experts and 3 US-based scholars, as well as 2 international speakers. And Ian Stewart just came from Canada for this lecture series. We are very thankful to all the speakers who came aboard and are sharing their knowledge and their passion and their vision and their concerns. And we are also very thankful to the groups that helped us, supported us financially, morally, and intellectually in this endeavor. And from outside the university, this includes the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence of the University of Colorado in Boulder and the European Union, as well as the New Mexico Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And then within UNM, we are thankful to the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Peace Studies Program, the Feminist Research Institute, University College, and the History Department for helping support us. And we will have 2 lectures that are quite connected, actually it's been for a while now I've been trying to get these 2 speakers in the same room, so it's kind of magic that it happened, and here they are. Jenny having just come back from her research trip in Africa, and Ian, as I mentioned, having come back from Canada, visiting from Canada. I will briefly introduce Ian, who is a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He holds a PhD in anthropology and history from the University of Michigan. It's very unusual. Actually, he's the first scholar I know with this kind of double PhD. And his research focuses on persistence and adaptation of slavery and unfree labor, leading to contemporary forms of slavery, including Sierra Leone's child soldiery, juxtaposed against parallel events in the 18th and 19th century. In addition to his academic PhD, he holds a Master's of Science from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University in New York and a BA in Political Science. Many academic honors. These include the Rackham Humanities Research Fellowship from the University of Michigan, the John Knight Fellowship from Stanford University, and the John McCloy Fellowship from Columbia. At the same time, he's the author of an award-winning book, the title of which is Unbossed, A War Reporter's Life on the Line. And that is a book that came out of his work as the associate, as a member of the Associated Press covering Africa, and he may or may not go into more detail about that. I'm very, very happy, as I said, that he's here. Last year he was the adjunct instructor for the International Studies program. And I would also like to introduce my colleague, Alfred Matheson from the law school, who will introduce his colleague then. And here we are.
I'll stay here. I am honored to introduce to you my colleague from the law school. She joined the faculty in 1995. She's a graduate of Amherst College and Harvard Law School. She is an internationally renowned scholar, having written books of humanitarian law, in action in Africa. She's co-authored a casebook on refugee law. She's written numerous law review articles on these subjects. She teaches courses in international law and human rights and refugee law. She's even supervised issues in our clinical law program. She is a scholarly activist. And she takes her scholarship and she acts upon it. Before she joined the law school faculty, she worked for the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. And after she joined the faculty, from time to time, she goes away to take on projects like for the UN High Commission on Refugees. Again, she has, in fact, just recently returned from Africa. And she has told me about all the screening she had to go through the airports. Her temperature's been checked numerous times.
And I was in East Africa.
She's on sabbatical this semester, but she has continued her activism. My email inbox has been flooded with emails from Professor Moore this semester, once for students who were looking to go to Artesia to help immigrant children at the detention center in Artesia. She has also, in terms of trying to raise funds for the victims of Ebola, another email that she sent. So international now scholar, a scholarly activist, and I can also say that she is a public intellectual. She has taken on blogging, and so she blogs on these subjects as well. And having known her and talked with her, not only is she this law professor, international scholar, scholarly activist, and public intellectual, she is a gospel singer and musician. I want to introduce to you Professor Jenny Moore, who has a passion for social justice for the peoples of the world.
I feel like I just got the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you, Alfred, and thank you, Eleni, and thank you, Ian. I feel very happy to be invited to this lecture series, and it feels like a classroom, which is the best way to talk about anything, is in a conversation. So I'm hoping that I will just speak for no more than 30 minutes, and then Ian's going to do a response, and then that will kick off a good Q&A, so that you'll have some time to ask questions, and so I won't feel like I have to stick to a script, as Eleni was saying, and cover every single issue possible. So thank you all for being here. So since there was a chalkboard here, I thought I would just put up some concepts that are relevant to this topic. So the title of the talk is Seeking Justice and Transformation, Social Transformation After Conflict, and focusing on Africa, not as the only place where the need for social transformation after warfare exists, but as places to hear people's stories and places of examples and places of trial and error and effort and new challenges and new debates about what we mean by transitional justice. So my topic in terms of situating it in the legal field of international law and human rights, is normally referred to as transitional justice. And transitional justice is the study of mechanisms that post-conflict societies seize on to try to help usher their people from protracted violence of warfare to durable peace. And so, having said that, there's a lot of terms that need to be debated. And even if we can't debate them fully, I think they need to be defined, or at least you have to have a better understanding of how I approach some of these terms, even though I'm learning about them all the time. So to start off with, what is transitional in transitional justice? What do we mean by transitioning from violence to nonviolence, from war to peace? But secondly, what is armed conflict? You know, does the violence of the cartels and the gangs in Central America and Mexico and other parts of the world, does that constitute armed conflict? These are questions that are not all going to be answered, but they're really important to pose. But most difficult of all, what is justice? What is the justice in transitional justice? So my title suggests one of my conclusions about justice, which is that it should be transformational. It shouldn't just be transitory or transitional or end-related. It should be process-related, and it should be life-giving, and it should be inclusive, and it should be a conversation, it should be a debate, it should be an engagement of former parties to the conflict, perpetrators, victims, women, children, labor, the church, the entire society. And so we're going to get to this framework, but we're also going to unpack it a little bit. And what I hope to do is to give a few profiles of women that I met on my recent trip to Kenya and Burundi, who inspired me to rethink some of my conception of what the justice is in transitional or transformative justice. So just to kind of give you my framework, so I wrote a book that was published a couple years ago called Humanitarian Law in Action Within Africa. And it profiles 3 countries coming out of armed conflict: Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Burundi. And it looks at those 3 countries as having reached a different conversation between what could be called 3, not exclusive, but important facets of justice. So criminal justice is what lawyers often think about when they think of post-conflict. Prosecuting the most responsible war criminals, people that have attacked civilians, people that have used rape as a tool of terror and of domination, people that have attacked entire communities based on sect or ethnicity or social caste, etc. But these other prongs of justice are extremely important, and in all 3 countries, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Burundi, these 2, frankly, get more emphasis than the first. And you hear again and again and again, what does it matter if 8 individuals in the the Revolutionary United Front, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, and the Civil Defense Forces of Sierra Leone got sent to prison in Rwanda, when we are still trying to get along with the people that burned our village and killed our uncle and conscripted our cousins. So this idea of truth commissions, reconciliation, forgiveness, amnesty, conversation, folks re-entering into conversation and relationship with each other, this is extremely important. And then the issue of the underlying socioeconomic conditions and inequalities that led to the war to begin with: poverty, socioeconomic inequality, entrenched, lack of education, lack of health care, lack of income generating opportunities. This is extremely important. So my book was really about looking at these 3 strands. You can think of it as a chair with 3 legs, or a braid with 3 strands, and they're not always equal. Sometimes one strand of the braid is thicker than the other. Sometimes 2 strands dominate. And in the first book, I looked at this sort of triad, if you want, of transitional or transformative justice, and then tried to see, well, what did Uganda think about this conversation of aspects of justice? What did Sierra Leone think about it? What did Burundi think about it? So we could spend hours talking just about Uganda, just about Sierra Leone, and just about Burundi, and not do them justice. But very, very generally, I think it's important that we situate ourselves historically and geographically in these three countries. So really briefly, Uganda had a civil war that lasted over 20 years, from 1986 until peace accord in 2008. And we all know of the Lord's Resistance Army. We all hear about Joseph Kony. There's a big, big emphasis on retributive justice after the LRA. But of the tens of thousands of people killed in the Ugandan war in northern Uganda, as many as 90% of those deaths are not attributable to the LRA. They're attributable to the Ugandan People's Defense Forces, the Army of Uganda. And even though there are war crimes prosecutions in the International Criminal Court against Kony and his chief deputies, there are no war crimes prosecutions against the UPDF. So if we were to situate Uganda within transitional justice, we could say that as a nation, a government, there has been an emphasis on war crimes prosecutions. But civil society insists upon historical truth and on a recognition of the inequalities, particularly in the north of Uganda, where there has been very unequal development in the mixed population, but importantly, ethnic Acholi population of that part of northern Uganda. So civil society in Uganda calls for more equal-handed criminal justice, going after the UPDF as well as the LRA, but also historical justice and looking at the socioeconomic underpinnings of violence. Sierra Leone, again, this is like way too focused, but Sierra Leone had a civil war that was in some ways in the shadow of Liberia, but it had its own causes, largely based in government corruption by both major parties, regardless of which ethnic group was deemed to be, Timini or Mende or other ethnic groups was deemed to be more, their cause was deemed to be more strengthened by a particular government. Some people have said that the civil war in Sierra Leone was youth, angry and abandoned by all public officials of all stripes, rising up in anger in forming the Revolutionary United Front. But by the late 1990s, that war had turned into kind of competitive banditry, frankly, between several factions, offshoots of the army, offshoots of the Revolutionary United Front, and fighting for resources, guns, diamonds to fuel very localized conflicts. Villages would be taken by one faction, taken by another, taken by a third. And the weariness of that war, frankly, finally led to a peace accord. So what about Sierra Leone in this construct? Sierra Leone did something very interesting and created two national procedures. A special court for Sierra Leone to prosecute those deemed most responsible for the violence against civilians during the war, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled loosely on South Africa's famous TRC. So what's interesting about Sierra Leone is they thought they could have, William Shabbos of Galway, University of Galway in Ireland, talks about Sierra Leone as having conjoined twins of transitional justice, a court and a commission. Retributive justice and reconciliative justice. Lots of criticism of Sierra Leone for doing that because it's very hard to have amnesty and truth going on when those same individuals could actually face the dock. And so there were mandate issues, there were problems of confidentiality, but the country gave real credence to the idea of reconciliative as well as retributive justice at the highest level. So civil society in Sierra Leone has said we need more than that. We need reconciliative justice at the local level. Because again, these national tribunals and commissions don't always trickle down to the rural areas. And so there are small town grassroots, Fambul talk, which in Creole means family talk, reconciliative, cleansing ceremonies for folks still living in community together who have not dealt with the trauma healing of the violence of the war. So what about Burundi? Now Burundi, insofar as Sierra Leone was in the shadow of Liberia in some ways, Burundi is very much in the shadow of what country? Of Rwanda. And Burundi's ethno-political conflict is not subsumed purely into what happened in Rwanda, but there are certainly certain similarities. The population is 85% Hutu, who were very, very kept down under the Belgian colonial power, and 15% Tutsi. But you can stop there and see the differences between the two countries. In Rwanda, the Hutu ruled for many, many years, from the late 50s all the way until the 90s, whereas in Burundi the opposite is true. The Tutsi dominated government and the army for many years until the early 90s. The other major difference between Burundi and Rwanda from the perspective of violence is that in Rwanda, up to 800,000 people, not only Tutsi, but significantly Tutsi, were killed in 10 weeks. And in Burundi, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, it's hard to know, people were killed on both sides in several directions, Hutu and Tutsi and Twa, in 10 years. So some people talk about it as a slow motion genocide. And that war began in 1993, and the peace accord was not completely signed by all the parties, but the last major rebel movement, the FNL, signed the peace accords in Burundi in 2005. So where does Burundi fit here? Well, Burundi, in some sense, didn't do anything here. No trials yet. And has talked about a truth commission, but it has been in fits and starts for several years. And finally, the Parliament of Burundi just passed an act mandating a truth commission. So where it goes, we don't know. But civil society in Burundi talks about this prong and says you cannot do transitional, transformative justice unless you look at the fact that in Burundi today, 67% of the population lives on $1 a day or less. 2/3 of the population. 90% illiteracy. 5 put on by the Hekima Institute of Peace Studies and International Relations, and it was on transitional justice in Africa. I mean, it was like a feast for me. You know, I met there were 300 people there, mostly Africans, 3 Americans, a couple Asians, a few Europeans, Kenyans, South Africans, people from Ghana, people from Uganda, people from Burundi. It was just incredible. So what I really want to do is to give a couple profiles from some of the women I met at that conference, and also to talk about one woman that I met in Burundi, because I took advantage of being in the region and went back to one of my 3 countries that I want to write a second book about. And the project for the second book is to say, what is the place of gender justice within this construct? How does it fit in, and how do women think it fits? And how do men and women think it fits? And how do men and women think gender justice is a part of transitional justice? So where I'd just like to situate ourselves is that there is a sense among feminist scholars especially, men and women, but it's very well expressed in a book called On the Front Lines, Gender, War, and the Post-Conflict Process by Finwala Ni Aulane and Dina Haynes and Naomi Kahn. And in their book, what they basically say in about 10 chapters, looking at all different aspects of the transitional justice process, is that women are completely left behind in transitional justice. From the very beginning of the first peace accord negotiation, who is it that's participating in those negotiations? Who is it?
Men.
It's men. And it's men who were leaders of factions that were fighting with arms. So it is men who were powerful during the war and who are empowered in the peace process because of the power they wielded during the war. So women do not engage almost exclusively male discussions about ceasefire. Maybe there are women that play symbolic roles. And then from there, when you get into setting up tribunals, commissions, social justice foundations, women are involved, but they are marginalized. And the other disturbing reality is that if you looked at violence against women, which is almost fetishized during war, sorry to say, but rape is almost made into a fixation, as if women are only victims, not sometimes perpetrators, and not survivors, constantly surviving. We focus on sexual violence during war. Sexual violence after war in these 3 countries is as high or higher than it was during the war. Domestic violence, violence in the community are higher. Now, it's very hard to get data, so you have to, and I'm not a quantitative person, so I read secondary stuff, and people have to do extrapolations, and they have to do sampling, and this is not the hardest data you could say, but there are disturbing trends that levels of violence go up after war. Why is that? Maybe because violence is normalized, maybe because men who were empowered, particularly during war, come back to economies that are unactive, where there are no jobs, and women are empowered because they have been taking on tasks that they didn't take on culturally before the war, like running households, like working in the informal economy. So we can debate that. The reality is, if transitional justice does not deal with the fact that violence against women is higher after war, then what are we doing here? There's no point to it. But it's not just physical violence against women. It's structural violence, it's poverty, it's the fact that women cannot get health care for their children. And if we look at Sierra Leone, if we look at what is going to happen because of this Ebola crisis in terms of putting back that economy, and Liberia and Guinea, so many, hopefully not decades, we recognize that we don't just care about physical forms of violence, we also care about social forms of violence. And one of the reasons the Ebola crisis has been so bad is because the healthcare infrastructures in these countries are so weak to begin with. The people who get sick are so sick to begin with. They have lived with malaria and diarrhea and basic waterborne and other illnesses. And so we've got to deal with the socioeconomic part of transitional justice, but we have to deal with the gender dimension of that. If women can't get health care for themselves and their babies to be and their children, they cannot engage fully in society. So I'm starting my project, and I'm at the very beginning of this idea of doing a second book that focuses on the same 3 countries, not because they're so special, but because it's important that we contextualize, that we don't generalize, that we see that solutions come out of specific contexts. And so I'm just starting to frame questions. And then when I was in Burundi, I sat down with a group of Quakers. There's a lot of Burundian Quakers, interestingly enough. And Quakers do nonviolent work. So they work on peace in various ways, including social peace and socioeconomic justice. So I'd ask questions like, what does violence mean to you? What does nonviolence mean? What is civil society? What is gender equality? So my questions are, how can transitional justice serve women? How do women perceive justice, nonviolence, and social transformation? What do women want from transitional justice? To what extent can women contribute and define what is meant by transitional justice? To what extent do men regard women's equality as an aspect of their own interest in a more just society? And finally, are women and men partnering in a vision of transformative justice? So I don't know the answer to those questions. That's kind of where I'm starting. So where I want to end today is just to give you a profile of a few women that address these issues in their daily work. So I'm going to start. I think these women would all allow me to give their full name, but because they're very public and they publish, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to use their first names and also their country of origin. So Aminata, a Senegalese woman who works for the Agency for Cooperation and Research and Development. It's an action research organization that focuses on socioeconomic development, including in post-conflict situations. So she gave a talk at the conference in Nairobi called Towards a Transformative Justice. So this term transformative justice is starting to get out there. You're seeing less transitional justice, which I think is a good thing, because that's really what we need to be talking about, is not just a period of 5 years, but really a whole commitment to a whole series of transformative enterprises and procedures. And so she says we need to look at transitional justice as an opportunity for gender justice. And we need to see it as an opportunity for men and women to work together to change the dynamics of their relationships throughout society. So she, like Finwala Nyauane and her co-writers, she talks about how marginalized women are in peace processes and transitional justice procedures, and what intense suffering comes to them and their families and everyone related to them because of that marginalization. So in her view, until we look at human rights abuses in peace or wartime with a lens of gender and with a female as well as a male face, we are not going to be committing ourselves to meaningful change, let alone social transformation. And so what she argues, what Aminata argues, is that when the ongoing suffering of women, particularly in this dimension, is acknowledged, we are going to question putting so many international funds into trying a half dozen, 12, 15 individuals, giving them, years and years of due process, which they deserve, at the expense of focusing on national reconciliation and focusing on socioeconomic restoration. She points to the fact that there is no justice in a society that is structurally unjust. We have to look at the structures of violence and not just the physical manifestations of violence. So then we have Lena. Lena is a Ugandan woman who is the director of an organization called Women, Peace, and Security. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on her, and I realize I have only about 5 more minutes, I think. So Lena, I met Lena at the conference, and she spoke on a gender panel. There were several gender panels, thank goodness, and gender trickled through the whole conference, but like always, there were special gender, discussions. And she gets up there. She's from northern Uganda. And then the war hit her community, and in 2001, her husband was disappeared. She considers herself a war widow, but she has never buried her husband. So she first tells you, I'm a war widow, and then she says, I am a rape survivor. And so, of course, that quiets the room a little bit. And she says, I was raped by soldiers of the Ugandan People's Defense Forces. And she demanded justice for herself. And she demanded prosecution. But there was no mechanism to prosecute those soldiers. They're as war criminals. They could be prosecuted for rape, they could be prosecuted for common crimes, but they could not be prosecuted as war criminals. They were prosecuted and they were convicted under a court-martial. So she actually corrected me when I said that Uganda has only done the retributive bit after the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army. She said court-martial is a very important procedure against the army. You might not call him a war criminal, but you call him a rapist, and that matters. But around the time that Lena was raped, a whole group of women in her community, young women, were raped. Most of them had fistulas coming out of it, amazing tearing in their bodies from that rape. And she demanded a group trial of 10 members of the Ugandan People's Defense Forces, and they were all convicted. And there was a judgment of reparations for the surviving women. So because I'm the kind of person who will say, this is not so important for women, this is important for women. And she would say, oh, no, no, no. Having accountability and having an end to impunity, if not for every single criminal act, but for some acts as symbolic of many more, that is important to women as well. So all these strands are important. Now, she was involved in Juba, in the peace process for northern Uganda. And the peace agreements were signed in Juba, so we talk about Juba. You know, after Juba is what happens after the peace accords. And she basically says, we, the women, went to Juba and we took it hostage. And they got gender language in the peace accords. They knew that it was symbolic and rhetorical, but it was important. And so she talks about rape as a manifestation of women's sexual objectification. But then she talks about what we do about rape too often as a re-victimization and a re-objectification of women as victims, as living victims. And what she says, we are not victims, we are stakeholders. And the antidote to what was done to us is for us to organize, to be political, and to act collectively. So her rallying cry at Juba and since is, we are not victims, we are stakeholders. Nothing about us without us. So that's her message. And then, finally, I will talk about one Burundian woman that I didn't meet in Kenya, but I met her when I went to meet with civil society groups in Burundi the week before the conference, and this is just a few weeks ago. And her name is Godel Yev. She founded, so she did not tell me her ethnicity, and what's really interesting about Burundi is there really is a dream about pan-ethnic, non-ethnic identity. They don't talk about ethnicity, they talk about communauté, community. But the two communities is a reference to the two racialized caste groups that we talk about when we talk about Rwanda and Burundi. But she was a refugee during the war in Tanzania, I believe. And so when she came back to Burundi, she and a group of repatriated women, and they formed a group called AFRABU, Association des Femmes Repatriées du Burundi. So basically just Repatriated Women's Association. I assumed it was an organization by and for repatriated women. And she said, absolutely not. We came back into our communities looking for land that we had left, that was now occupied by other people. The people who never left were not integrated into the local economy because there was no local economy. The people who had been internally displaced but hadn't crossed a border, they also had no access to jobs, health care, education, food. And the former combatants who had been responsible for misery in those communities, they needed health care and they needed jobs so that they didn't get back into mischief, as she put it. So integration and reintegration of refugees had to be reintegration and integration of everybody. So what she does is help form cooperatives for women and for men. And what's interesting is that women traditionally are the cooperative farmers in Burundi, and men are not. But guess what? When there started being money associated with being a cooperative, there are now quite a number of men's cooperatives and co-ed cooperatives as well. But most of the cooperatives, I don't mean to be too mean, gender mean, but most of the cooperatives are women's cooperatives, and they do micro enterprise. So it might be, let's say we're a co-op. We might decide that every week we all have to contribute 1,000 francs, which is 70 cents. And then we pool that, and we might decide, let's say Ted has a friend who has land, who's willing to hire us by day. So we might use that money to buy a few tools and then hire ourselves out to that farmer, and then we'd have that income which we could decide how to use. Maybe for school fees, maybe for transport to get to a health clinic, etc. So it's micro enterprise. And then also microfinance. So Yev goes around to banks and says, hey, you got to stop just giving construction loans. You got to give micro loans. And guess what? We've done the research, and women tend to pay back their loans. They're good credit risks. So her message is that cooperative development has to include everybody. Women and men, former victims, former victimizers, those who were displaced, those who stayed, those who are returning. So I think I'm out of time, and I do want to leave time for Ian and also for questions. And I'll just leave it to say that transitional justice has to be contextualized. We have to start where people live. And we have to start with the reality of their lived lives and not just the rhetoric behind reconciliation, retribution, restoration. And as Lena, the Ugandan activist, said, you know, transitional or transformative justice should be a bridge between law and justice. And it should be based, the bridge should be based on people's lived experiences. Thank you very much.
Shift over if that's okay. Okay, swap seats with So Jenny, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. There's so much to think about. It's interesting. I wish we'd had time to meet before. I would have loved to sit down and have coffee with you. Some of these issues are exactly what I'm researching and studying. Some of the things that really struck me that I just wanted to touch on real quick was the idea of social forms of violence and justice. One of the ones, and of course most of my research and work is done on Liberian Sierra Leone, so that's where I'm going to draw most of my references to. But I'm interested in the stigmatization, particularly of children. And you've got these kids that weren't really offenders to start with. They're victims. I mean, these are kids whose families have already been wiped out, and then they're taken away and turned into perpetrators. They're kidnapped, and they're drugged, they're put through all kinds of initiation processes, and then forced to become killers themselves. Where does that fall? How would they fall into the line of finding justice? What kind of justice would they even seek? I mean, I'm thinking of Mahmoud Mandani's book, When Victims Become Killers, about Rwanda. And where does the line go from perpetrator, victim to perpetrator? And where does that fall in the realm of social justice?
Well, I'd be interested in what you think about that. So just maybe to start with sort of honoring the question, because I think the issue of victims and perpetrators and perpetrators being victims is something that percolates through probably any post-conflict society. So I do think there's a recognition that kids who are forced to commit atrocities are themselves victims of human rights abuses. But that doesn't take away from the difficulty with reintegrating kids who have been socialized and acculturated and psychologically prepared and living that kind of life of violence. So that reintegration, even if you can rhetorically say they are victims and they deserve reintegration, doing it can be really, really difficult. So I guess I would leave it there and be interested in what you thought about that.
Well, that's one of the observations is these kids, like I mentioned, their families, and for the most part, the RUF would run through a village and kill all the adults and take kids and turn them into these killers themselves. And the scarification, they'd have RUF on their forehead or on their chest or their arm. Very hard to integrate them. And they were little, so they don't know what their home village is, so they don't know where do you take them after the war to get them back into society. So, I mean, you have this secondary phenomenon where, I mean, I study slavery and contemporary forms of slavery. These kids, I think, were enslaved as child soldiers. And after the fact, they can't get back into school or to jobs, so there's an ongoing kind of victimization that I don't know where that would fall into. How do you deal with that in terms of justice?
Well, I guess I would put it under the idea of needing to rebuild relationships, which would be the reconciliative and the social. And I really wouldn't deal with it under the retributive. If anything, I tended that my prejudice is away from that prong anyway. But certainly, if you were gonna seize on people, it would be the ones who were enslaved and not the now young adult or middle-aged adults who were enslaved as children. But saying that is easy. How do you do social justice? How do you get those kids and young people in school and in jobs? How do you keep them together as sort of a society that understands each other? In some ways, some of the issues we're seeing in Central America around, gang violence in Central America that was partly caused by, deportations from the United States and acculturation to violence on the streets, because there was, there's certain parallels as to what you do with that kind of work, basically. Kids get involved in war as either they're enslaved, but it becomes their life's work, and how do you re-educate and reintegrate somebody from that? It's very, very difficult, but conceptually where I put it would be that they deserve social justice and they deserve reconciliation. And to the extent that they want justice from the person who enslaved them, I guess suppose they deserve accountability too.
Sure. I want to make sure there's time for everyone else. But one real quick anecdote, and I just wanted to throw it out to the audience then. I just wanted to let you know that I was in Sierra Leone when the verdict came down on Taylor. And the reaction was not what you think it would be. I was expecting everyone to be so relieved and this great bit of justice done, but they were like, okay, how is that going to bring back my house? How's that going to get my kids in school and recover the country? Whereas you get back, when I came back from my trip there at the time, the New York Times banner headline about expat Sierra Leoneans were celebrating. It was a really big deal for them, not for the people still surviving in the country. Very different sense of what justice is in country.
Absolutely.
I will leave it at that. And thank you again. It was a wonderful talk. Are there any questions? No questions. Somebody's got to have a question.
So there is chocolates there, and you have to ask a question to have a chocolate.
Yeah. Nothing? Yeah, hi.
I'd be interested to hear your comments about how time plays into the processes, because some of these processes take decades, and by that time, people have aged, people have died, people have made accommodations to the tragedies of their lives. So, I mean, how important is it for things to happen very promptly versus things to very, very slowly work their way through? I don't know.
Well, I think that's definitely, contextual to answer that. Like, I don't think there's one answer to that. Certainly there's a debate about it almost anywhere I've been, where some people are saying, let's let bygones be bygones, or this will take time, or versus there's a sense of urgency. So I don't think there's any simple answer to that. But one thing that was extremely interesting to me, I was in Kenya, and Kenya often sees itself as a place, of law and order and development and higher standard of living and things like that. And there was election violence after 2007 in the Rift Valley area that was ethnic political in nature, and really brutal stuff happened. And in fact, Kenyatta Uhuru and his vice president are both indicted criminals against humanity in the ICC. And in fact, when I was in Kenya, Uhuru was in The Hague. I mean, it was bizarre. We were talking about transitional justice, and the president was in The Hague. And what happened at this conference was people were saying, we Kenyans can no longer delude ourselves into thinking that we can't kill each other. That it can happen anywhere. People can get enough power hungry and enough oppressive that there will be a cataclysm of violence. But what was really interesting is that I was sitting next to a professor of theology, who I didn't know was a professor of theology. I just knew there was steam coming out of his ears because he was so upset at the discussion. And he was like, why are we talking about 2007? He said, my childhood was spent living here and there and here and there because my family was displaced by the British during the Mau Mau uprising in the late 50s and early 60s. What about justice for me? We are still traumatized. So to me, what that kind of meant is that there is a need for reconciliation over time. And that even though things have been papered over, doesn't mean that it isn't important to do some of this middle strand of truth and reckoning. But things have a double edge. Things, when you have a conversation, you inflame, and there can be, retribution. So it's not an easy process. But it does seem to me that part of your point seemed to be that taking time rather than doing everything immediately may be an important thing to do. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
I want to hear comments on the lack of sufficient aid between other nations, not providing enough resources.
Yes,
Any foreign European nations, U.S. government, etc.
absolutely.
I want to hear your
I
comments.
agree with you. No, I mean, I think it is a travesty. It
It
is a
is.
travesty, you know, that we waited on Ebola, and now whoever we is, you know, the international community, the World Health Organization, the United States government, whatever, we waited on Ebola, and Ebola is a conflagration now. I mean, it's being contained, I believe, slowly, it's gonna go, you know, I'm a hopeful person, but it's gonna start to plane the new cases. But all the suffering, all the death, because of no ability to commit money to preventive health care, let alone restorative health care before things get out of control. So, I mean, I think it's all mixed up. I think we put money into weapons, we put money into, you know, militarizing, you know, going in and fighting ISIS. You know, I'll just be really clear that I think we should have had a humanitarian intervention in West Africa instead of a military intervention in Iraq and Syria. But people don't listen to me. So, but I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that there needs to be a huge upending of priorities in terms of international investment in conflict. And it should go into preventing it and not engaging in it.
Not to get off subject, but like we could provide with the Ebola crisis, we could provide a really sufficient amount of physicians, nurses, healthcare practitioners to go over there to it doesn't even have to be the top doctors, you know, but just to go over there and provide, you know, aid for the victims of crisis of Ebola countries like Liberia and other countries. I think
We will discuss that issue in class.
I think you're right.
You know,
you don't even have to take the top
some,
physicians, you know. You just take like the bare minimum. Everyone here is qualified as a really good healthcare
Nurse
practitioner,
practitioner,
opposed to those-
physician's assistant,
Exactly.
basic. I mean, one thing that's really working in Sierra Leone is people going out and educating families about not being afraid, not, you know, washing their hands, not embracing their loved ones who've died, disposing, you know, burying bodies safely, basic public health education. I think one of the problems, and I'm not talking about Ebola here, but one of the problems is there aren't the beds for these folks. There aren't it's gonna take a while to get on top of this, but I think you're right. We need clinics. We need healthcare practitioners.
We talk about putting a ban and a sanction on traveling to those countries, but why not just go over there where the crisis is and attack it where it is, instead of everyone talking about how it's an issue of people from those countries coming over there and going over there, etc. I think that's a really significant point.
I do not know
You're right.
much in depth about the Lord's resistance, the Lord's, what is it? The Lord's
Resistance Army.
Yeah. What is its sustenance, the source of surviving, resisting established state government? It doesn't have base outside of the country. You know what
Yes, I don't know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I don't know, but I can tell you that the LRA, when it got pushed out of northern Uganda, it's still alive and functioning in Central African Republic, parts of Darfur, Democratic Republic of the Congo. I think what feeds it is dysfunction and the ability to go into a village, just like they did in northern Uganda, burn the village down, steal a bunch of stuff, get some resources, sell some timber, whatever, get some arms. But it is pretty remarkable, how an army, a movement like that can survive in little pockets of activity in three, 4 countries and wreak havoc.
At the same time, it's a thorn on the side for the government of Uganda.
Indeed.
And calling into question its performance as a state and defense of territory, stability, law and order within. So it reflects upon an extreme weakness on the part of Mussolini's government.
No, you're right, you're right.
So, well, that's just a comment that, so there are some 15 of us students here, and I invited them.
Excellent, I'm so happy you did, I'm so happy you did.
I want to say one last thing.
I think we really do need to let other people out.
Okay, I'm
Well,
Sorry.
I'm looking at the clock,
Yeah.
and I noticed that
Yeah.
this was in at 3, and you have some students here, but I really would like to say something critically important, so I think I'll give my time up to the students, but I've got a lot to say.
You can start.
Are you ready to get in? I can take a few moments of the speaker's time?
We'll bargain.
Okay, there's a lot here that needs to be unpacked. As you mentioned before, it's always about contextualization of the lived experience and the social cognition of people. And in that regard, you know, as you talk about historical justice, you know, we can't overlook the whole idea of historical institutions. And, you know, and look at the whole impact of colonialism, neocolonialism, and their impact on people, particularly within Liberia and Sierra Leone. And I'll say something later about that, about health stuff, because I'm an epidemiologist and I teach global health in Ebola from the North Campus. Having said that, though, it is about structural violence for the most part. So my question really in some ways is that, well, let me start with another brief comment first. Einstein once said that you can't solve the problems of the world with the same type of thing that created them in the first place. And so as we go rushing off into the African continent, using purely Eurocentric constructs, which have pluses and minuses in them, can we really expect them to be accepted and workable to bring about a durable peace, you know, within the confines of that history? So what I'm asking is, are there some folks who are also looking at traditional and indigenous knowledge and looking at this from an Afrocentric perspective and bringing that history and those historical perspectives that are bringing things forward? Like as we talk about genderism, aside from feminism issues, there's an African concept of African womanism that just totally blows everything out of the water, that empowers women and all the other things. So that's totally neglected because Western constructs and globalization and neoliberalism always, you know, in the forefront of that. So there's a lot that needs to be unpacked, I think, but I'm not saying that it can't work, but I think you have to look at the root causes of it all
I
and not
agree.
just deal with the effects.
No, I completely agree. And, you know, go to Liev, the Burundian woman that I spoke to, she actually had a sort of kindred way of looking at it, which was she said, how we can't use the constructs that got us here in getting us out of here. So if the war and the colonialism created these divisions, we can't use these, we can't reify these divisions to solve it. But again, how to do that, like identifying the need to do that, I think part of it is working in community with people that are trying to take these rhetorical concepts and make them work. And it's not a pretty process. It's very fits and starts, but that's the way it's got to
It
be.
lies the rub.
That's where the rhetoric meets the
But that
road.
doesn't mean that we stop from trying things. We need to be more socially inclusive of the work so we can build a type of cohesion.
I agree. So we should give the floor over, right? Thank you all.
So I wanted to thank Eleni first very much for a wonderful introduction. It makes me sound so much more impressive than I actually am, but thank you so much for that. I also wanted to note that I love New Mexico. This is my second home. I've been living here since 2010. I'm in British Columbia for a year, and how can you tell I've been in British Columbia when you wear a corduroy jacket to New Mexico in October? So if you don't mind, I'm going to take this off and give it more casual. Anyway, I wrote this lecture on the flight in, so pardon me if I'm ambitious and I took on a bit more than I can tackle in this talk, but I wanted to really take this talk at the spirit of the series. So I really wanted to sort of look at Africa, the idea of modern Africa and where that fits into what we're talking about today. Before I launch into my full lecture, though, I really would like to take a second just to recognize that I've got a lot of friends and colleagues in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and in Guinea who are surviving horrific times right now. And I just think it's really important that we just take a moment and recognize that, the news makes it seem as though what's happening in Texas or in Spain or elsewhere is the most horrific thing in the world. That pales in comparison to the suffering that people in these countries in the Guinea coast are surviving right now. So just take a moment and recognize how people are surviving through at the moment. I wasn't really going to talk about Ebola, and Eleni, I hope you'll forgive me, I'm going to stray from the title of my topic a bit, but I did think it was important that we look at it, because if this really is a lecture series on modern societies in crisis, then Ebola really underscores one of those crises. It's far too easy for observers and journalists, which I was a former one, to look at Africa and place blame on Africa for Ebola, and especially now that it's spread to Europe and parts of North America. But far too often I'm paying attention to the news. And what I'm seeing basically is journalists and pundits, in effect, saying, this can't or it won't happen here. We have state-of-the-art medical equipment. We can contain Ebola. We can control Ebola. Ebola empirically can be controlled fairly easily. It's not that difficult a disease to contain and control. But to do that requires facilities, it requires training, and more than anything else, it requires money. And to me, what I think is important to take away from Ebola right now is it represents the Achilles heel of Africa. And by saying that, what I mean is that Africa's Achilles heel is the fact that it's struggled to overcome lingering deficits from over 500 years of exploitation. It's ongoing media representations that Africa is and remains unmodern, uncivilized, and violent. These are the kinds of things we need to move away from. In West Africa, we've got those 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. They are in dire straits, and they don't have the means to control the disease. And there's a real reason for that. They don't have healthcare workers that they need. They don't have the first responders. They scarcely have the infrastructure that's required, or the beds. As Jenny said, there's not enough beds for people to actually be getting the treatment they need. A lot of that has to do with the fact that modern healthcare service sector has been painfully slow to respond to West Africa. I was talking to a friend of mine who also works in Sierra Leone, and she has family still back in Sierra Leone, and she was describing it as this whole Ebola crisis is basically like watching death in slow motion. I couldn't agree more. To me, though, this is a crisis that's been unfolding since December last year, and still, there's so little being done to help people in West Africa. But why has it been in slow motion? If it has been in slow motion, why has the world been so slow to respond? You look at the round-the-world, round-the-clock news coverage, and this is another problem. I could talk about that ad nauseum another day, but you've got pundits that are blaming, and it comes around to looking at Africa in fault. They say things like, they, as in Africa, don't have the facilities. They can't contain it, and they can't control Ebola. And unfortunately, they're absolutely right.